you have it. Tim Walz and J.D. Vance faced off in the vice presidential debate, but did they help or hurt their running mates? I'm Mychael Schnell. This is America's Vote 2024 coverage of tonight's debate. Joining me now is the Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack, and national political reporter, Julia Manchester. Guys, there's a lot to cover. I want to get right into it. First off, key takeaways. Who won? Who lost? What were the core moments here? Bob, we'll go to you first.
Well, listen, I think Vance needed a good night because Harris clearly won the debate against former President Trump. And did he win? I think maybe he won on points, but overall he held his own, and I think he had a good night, so I think there's some momentum. But the one thing that I think was great about this debate was that they shook hands, they were civil. It wasn't an embarrassing debate like the first debate in 2020 between Biden and Trump. This was a debate America can be proud of. It was substantive. They dodged questions, no doubt about it. But it was nice in this polarizing election year to have them actually be civil.
Right. There was a ton of that camaraderie at a number of moments, them saying, oh, well, I agree with you on this, and then a few words later tearing into them and their opponents. But you did have that camaraderie. Julia, I want to give you a chance to respond also. Key takeaways, what are your thoughts?
Well, look, I think it was refreshing, certainly, to see a debate like this. As Bob said, I think, walking away from this debate, looking at this, I could see, a voter maybe saying, oh, I could have a beer with both of these guys, maybe both of them together, really.
And bar to clear.
Yeah, a clear bar, but also I think very important for Vance to clear that bar. I think there has been this perception that he's maybe not as likable as Tim Walz. Tim Walz really comes off as this nice guy, sort of America's dad. Vance has been seen as more intense, more partisan, so it was good that he was able to get that across. But I think on delivery, Vance certainly had the best night, and I think Vance, quite frankly, just has more practice. Look, Tim Walz has not done a ton of national interviews. Vance, in many ways, has gone into the belly of the beast. He's not only going on to conservative outlets, but also other outlets that may be perceived as less than friendly towards conservatives. So I think he had that. He was warmed up and clearly was polished.
I want to get into the first topic because there was a lot of policy discussed in tonight's debate. The first topic they started off with was the situation in the Middle East after earlier today the Iranian missile strike on Israel. The moderators had asked both candidates, would you have a preemptive strike against Iran? Now, both candidates didn't exactly answer the question. Tim Walz tearing into and noting some criticism of former President Trump's aides, what they've said about him. J.D. Vance then going into saying, well, there was a deterrence factor during the Trump administration. They thought that, was successful. What did you make of that conversation, and particularly the Walz portion? Because the situation in the Middle East, more the Gaza war, has been such a difficult issue for Democrats. Did Walz do enough tonight to sort of appease some detractors, but also keep others close to home?
I think Walz did well. I think it was interesting that they've been exchanging this, hey, you're weird and you're weird. And to Julia's point, they weren't weird tonight. They were normal. At the same time, I thought Walz was shakiest at the front on that first question on Iran. He didn't answer the question, as you mentioned. Vance didn't either. There were so many questions, especially about the nation's debt. Neither one answered. But I think that it's tough for Walz to handle that because who's in charge now? The Democrats are in charge. Biden and Harris. And I think Vance did a very good job of reminding people, hey, she's vice president. She could have done these plans earlier, but she hasn't. And I think, to Julia's point, he was more polished than Walz. That doesn't mean Walz was bad, but Vance, and I watched his Senate debate a while back, and Vance is an impressive debater.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, on that note about how they responded to the situation in the Middle East, I think Walz comes from a very unique position on this. He's the governor of Minnesota. Where did the uncommitted movement start? It started in Minnesota. You have a big Arab American population, Muslim American population in that state that I'm sure Tim Walz is very familiar with. So this has got to be some sort of an adjustment for him where he's really, been involved in this community, has probably ties to that community as governor of that state. But now that he's vice president, he's more, I would say, sort of the mainstream foreign policy of the Democratic Party. And under President Biden, it is more pro-Israel. And he was very pro-Israel out of the gate. So, I don't think the uncommitted movement is necessarily going to sink the Democratic Party this time around. But he's walking a very fine line for his own personal political reasons.
I also just want to stick on this topic of foreign policy. There was a bit of an awkward moment on the debate stage when Tim Walz was pressed about comments he made about visiting Tiananmen Square and being there for those protests. They were recently unearthed by CNN. He essentially gave a non-answer and then said, well, I did misstep. We have a video of that, so let's see it, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
all I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said. So I was in Hong Kong and China during the democracy protests, went in. And from that, I learned a lot of what needed to be in governance.
I mean, Bob, even without hearing it, you could see the awkwardness in his facial expressions and his body language. He said he made a misstep, but it was just awkward.
It was awkward. I mean, even to the point where he called himself a knucklehead, which I always think is good. I mean,
relatable.
Self-deprecating humor is good. But it was awkward, and he wasn't comfortable with it, and that's what we need more of. That's why, honestly, we need all these candidates to do more interviews, specifically on the Democratic side, though, because they've got to be tested. You can't be careful. I think if you're looking at the presidential debate right now, you'd rather be her than him, but there's a real danger of her being too cautious at the moment.
And Julia, that's actually something we were talking about. That's what somebody had mentioned. We were looking at the commentary online and from different pundits. Someone saying that, well, Kamala Harris and J.D. Vance were both sort of blocked from doing more media interviews. J.D. Vance, since the start, has been thrown into these difficult situations, friendly anchors, but also not some friendly anchors, and he's been tested, and it kind of showed on the debate stage tonight.
Absolutely. It was good practice for him. It warmed him up. Look, I think from the Republican perspective, they go into these debates with what we would consider mainstream outlets. They consider it hostile territory, so he knew sort of what to expect. There was obviously that moment where there was a bit of a kerfuffle over the fact-checking, the mics were muted, etc. I thought there was some commentary that I saw online saying, well, don't mute the mics. They were actually having a policy discussion and disagreeing with each other, but it was, somewhat productive in a way. But, certainly good practice for Vance there. But it's interesting, someone connected to the Harris campaigner in that orbit texted me and essentially said, they characterized it as Tim Walz came across as normal, as a normal American. J.D. Vance is the sleek politician here. So it's interesting to see that narrative starting to circulate.
Politics is as easy as being normal or weird. It's on such a granular level these days. Next topic I wanted to get to, abortion politics, which was on the debate stage in full display. J.D. Vance had such an interesting messaging standpoint on this, saying that Republicans need to earn back the trust of the public when it comes to women's reproductive rights. Republicans have obviously struggled to coalesce around a message that works on abortion politics. It's been something that Democrats have really had a rout on when you talk about their success in it. I haven't heard this messaging before, Republicans saying, well, we need to work at this. It was pretty clear based on polling and based on anecdotes. But to hear a candidate say that on the stage, I thought it was striking. I'm curious how you think it was.
Yeah, I think it was good. I think it's good when candidates actually address what's going on head on. We've seen that in a special election in the House on Long Island. Tom Suozzi dealt with immigration head on. He won by about 8 points, and I think that was smart. Walz did dodge a question that Democrats have dodged on third-term trimester abortions. But overall, this debate, I think, is not going to matter in the long run. However, there are a lot of Democrats, I know you talked to some of them, who are still like, maybe Shapiro should have been picked. I'm not saying Walz was a bad pick, but if Harris doesn't win Pennsylvania, there'll be a lot of second guessing.
Julie, I want to get your take on A, the abortion politics, and B, the second thing that Bob mentioned. We saw such an intense sweepstakes on the Democratic side. A lot of people were a bit surprised when Walz was chosen. Folks saw Shapiro as the front runner. I think we've seen with Walz's folksy manner what the Harris campaign was going for, but I think a lot of folks were also wondering what would a vice presidential candidate, Josh Shapiro, have looked like on the debate stage tonight.
I think Josh Shapiro, and I don't mean this in any knock on Shapiro or Harris, but he would have brought maybe a different set of problems to the ticket. I think no candidate is perfect. They all come with their own baggage. Josh Shapiro strikes me as someone who does not want to be number two to anyone else. He has, he has that very clear leadership ambition. He likes to be the executive, and I think there was a concern that someone like Shapiro, someone who does bring that rock star energy, whether it's in a a smaller press gaggle or a giant arena in Philadelphia, for example, that someone like him could potentially overshadow Harris. And I think there were questions as to whether both of them thought they were the best team for this moment. I thought it was interesting that Shapiro was all over cable news ahead of this, very much touting and boosting Tim Walz ahead of that debate.
Including Fox News.
Including Fox News. He's on Fox
To his credit.
To his credit, yeah. So very much trying to to push that. On the abortion side of this, though, look, this is very important for Republicans. They have to address this because 2 years after Roe versus Wade was overturned, I don't think they have figured out the right messaging on this. They're not united. You have these questions of, is it a 6-week ban? Is it a 15-week ban? In Florida, for example, you have Ron DeSantis pushing to keep that 6-week ban in place. In Maryland, you have Larry Hogan fully embracing abortion rights. In Virginia, you have Glenn Youngkin talking about the 15-week ban. That didn't work out for him in last year's elections in Virginia. So I know I talked about the East Coast there, but Republicans have not figured out a strategy on this that works. Some Republicans online I saw liked J.D. Vance's response. They think that maybe it should be a blueprint going forward, but we'll see how voters respond.
Yeah, and on your point, it's not just still the fallout effects of Roe v. Wade. Well, in part it is, but it's that now all these states are having these referenda about whether or not abortion should be curtailed in their states. I've spoken to a lot of House Democrats. They think that could help drive these voters to the polls. So it's still very much so a salient issue. Another matter I want to talk about.
One thing I want to say.
Yeah.
We got a month to the election. When are they going to get the message right?
Exactly.
It's getting late in the game, isn't it?
Yeah.
You may have a blueprint. It's a little late to implement.
Well, and on that note, though, I'll talk about Florida just for a quick second. Florida has a history of their voters voting for liberal ballot measures. 2020, they voted to raise the minimum wage, but they turned around and they voted for Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. I think that's that could be expected this time, where they will vote for Donald Trump and Rick Scott, but enshrine abortion rights. We don't know. They have to hit that 60% threshold, but it's possible.
Absolutely. Another thing we have to talk about, Springfield, Ohio. It won't go away, so we have to address it. J.D. Vance, Tim Walz brought it up at first, which I thought was interesting. J.D. Vance addressed it. He then got into this little odd tit for tat with the moderators. What did you make of how he handled this controversy, and is it ever going to go away?
Well, no, I don't think so, because eating pets is something that people understand. At the same time, I think Vance in some ways has been unfairly criticized on some issues, but he's kept doubling down on his campaign. He's kept doubling down on the eating pets thing, and it just hasn't panned out. So I think if you're a Republican, you want this issue to go away. It has not worked, and I'm not surprised Walz brought it up.
Julia, your thoughts on the Springfield conversation?
Look, I think that was, not surprising that Walz brought it up. That's an easy one for him to put J.D. Vance on the defense. If they want to talk about Springfield, they could have talked about, from the Republican perspective, the conservative perspective, how it's emblematic of the broken immigration system of dumping these migrants or sending these migrants to these cities and having, these cities have to deal with, this is just from their perspective, deal with the fallout from that or deal logistically with that. But instead, we're still talking about this conspiracy theory, a month after the first debate or second debate?
And there's roughly a month to go, so if time tells you, it doesn't look like it's going anywhere. All right, Julia, Bob, thank you guys so much. When we come back, we'll dive into the state of polling in the presidential race. Stick around for more of America's Vote 2024, special coverage of the vice presidential debate.